Marcus had never seen such fancy gates before. The golden bars stretched high into the sky, and behind them stood the most magnificent palace he had ever laid eyes on. But Marcus wasn't there to admire the beauty. He was there because he was angry, desperate, had nowhere else to turn. The 17-year-old boy had been living on the streets of London for 3 years. His clothes were torn and dirty, his sneakers had holes that let the cold rain seep through, and his stomach hadn't seen a proper meal in 2 days. But today was different. Today, Marcus had heard something that made his blood boil. Earlier that morning, while searching through garbage bins behind a fancy restaurant, he overheard 2 well-dressed men talking. They were discussing how the royal family had just approved the demolition of the old community center where Marcus and dozens of other homeless kids used to sleep during winter nights. The building was going to be torn down to make space for another luxury shopping mall. "Those rich people don't care about us," Marcus muttered to himself as he approached the palace gates. "They sit in their golden rooms while we freeze outside." Massive iron gates were guarded by 2 royal guards dressed in their traditional red uniforms and tall black hats. They stood perfectly still, like statues, their eyes fixed straight ahead. Marcus had heard stories about these guards, how they never moved, never spoke, never reacted to anything. People from all over the world came to try to make them laugh or flinch, but they remained motionless. But Marcus wasn't there to play games. He was there to demand answers. As he got closer, he noticed other tourists taking pictures with the guards, laughing and making silly faces. Some were trying to distract them with jokes and funny dances. The guards remained completely still, as if nothing was happening around them. Marcus felt his anger growing stronger. Here were people treating this like entertainment while he and his friends had nowhere to sleep when winter came. The contrast between the tourists' joy and his own desperation made him feel sick. He walked right up to the gate and pressed his face against the cold metal bars. The guard closest to him was a tall man with a serious face, probably in his 30s. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his boots were shining, and his posture was absolutely straight. "Hey!" Marcus shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "Hey, you in the funny hat?" The tourists around him started to giggle, thinking this was just another attempt to get a reaction from the guard. But there was something different in Marcus's voice, something raw and desperate that made a few people stop laughing and pay attention. The guard didn't move, not even an eyelash. Marcus gripped the bars tighter, his knuckles turning white. "No, you can hear me. I need to talk to someone in there about the community center." Still no reaction. The anger that had been building up inside Marcus for months finally exploded. "Do people live like kings while kids like me sleep in the rain? You're tearing down the only warm place we had. And for what? Another place for rich people to buy things they don't need?" His voice was getting louder, and more tourists were starting to gather around, sensing that something real was happening. This wasn't a performance or a joke. This was a young man's genuine pain spilling out onto the street.
"How my little sister
died last winter because she got sick sleeping outside," Marcus continued, tears starting to form in his eyes. "Was only 14. Maybe if she had a warm place to stay, she'd still be alive." The crowd grew silent. Even the tourists stopped taking pictures. Marcus wiped his eyes with his dirty sleeve and looked directly into the guard's face. "I don't care if you're not supposed to move or talk. I know you're human. I know you can hear me. And I know that. Somewhere behind that stone face, you have a heart." For a moment, everything was quiet except for the sound of London traffic in the distance. The guard remained perfectly still, but something in the air had changed. The atmosphere was no longer light and playful. It had become heavy with emotion and truth. Marcus stepped back from the gate, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He had said what he came to say, but he wasn't done yet. He could feel the eyes of everyone around him, tourists, other street, kids who had gathered to watch, and most importantly, the guard who stood just a few feet away. "I'm not leaving until someone listens to me," Marcus declared, his voice now steady and determined. "I don't care how long it takes." He sat down on the cold pavement, crossed his arms, and stared directly at the guard. The tourists didn't know what to do. Some walked away, uncomfortable with the heavy emotions. Others stayed, curious to see what would happen next. But Marcus didn't care about the crowd anymore. His focus was entirely on the man in the red uniform. The man who represented everything Marcus felt was wrong with the world. A system that protected the wealthy while ignoring the suffering of the poor. What Marcus didn't know was that behind the guard's trained exterior, something was stirring, something that would change both of their lives forever. Officer James Patterson had been a royal guard for 8 years. He had mastered the art of standing perfectly still for hours, ignoring every distraction that came his way. Drunk tourists, crying children, protesters, entertainers he had seen. It all, and remained unmoved. But something about this young man's words was different. As Marcus sat on the ground staring at him, James felt something he hadn't experienced in years while on duty. Genuine emotion. The boy's story about his sister hit him like a punch to the stomach. James had a younger sister too, Sarah, who was about the same age. The thought of her sleeping in the cold, getting sick, dying alone, it made his carefully maintained composure crack just slightly. But James couldn't move. His training was absolute. Royal Guards never broke character, never showed emotion, never acknowledged the public while on duty. It was more than just a job requirement. It was a sacred tradition that went back hundreds of years. Hours passed. The morning turned to afternoon, and still Marcus sat there, his eyes never leaving James's face. Other tourists came and went, taking pictures and moving on when they realized nothing exciting was happening. But Marcus remained patient and determined. James's feet were starting to hurt, but that was normal. What wasn't normal was the way his mind kept wandering to the boy's words. He thought about his comfortable apartment, his regular meals, his warm bed. He thought about the difference between his life and Marcus's life, and for the first time, the contrast made him uncomfortable. As the afternoon sun began to set, something unexpected happened. Rain started to fall first, just a light drizzle, then heavier drops that made the tourists run for cover under nearby shop awnings. But Marcus didn't move. He sat there in the rain, his thin jacket quickly becoming soaked, water dripping from his hair down, his face. James watched as the boy started to shiver, but still refused to leave his spot. The determination in Marcus's eyes never wavered, even as his lips began to turn blue from the cold. Other people on the street hurried past with umbrellas. Marcus had no protection from the weather. This was when James felt something break inside him. His training told him to ignore the boy, to focus straight ahead, to maintain his position no matter what. But his humanity was screaming at him to do something, anything, to help this young man who was suffering right in front of him. The internal battle was intense. James had never faced such a conflict between his duty and his conscience. He thought about his career, his reputation, the consequences he would face if he broke protocol. Royal Guards who broke character could be dismissed, disgraced, lose everything they had worked for. But then he looked at Marcus again, really looked at him. The boy's clothes were completely soaked now. His whole body was shaking from the cold. But his eyes still held that same determination. He wasn't asking for money or food or special treatment. He was asking for someone to care, someone to listen, someone to acknowledge that his pain mattered. James made a decision that would change everything, very slowly. Almost imperceptibly at first, James began to move his eyes. It was the smallest possible movement, just a slight shift of his gaze from straight ahead to looking down at Marcus. To anyone else, it might have looked like nothing. But to Marcus, who had been studying every inch of the guard's face for hours, it was everything. Their eyes met for just a second, but in that second, something powerful passed between them. James saw the pain, the hope, the desperate need for human connection in Marcus's eyes, and Marcus saw something he never expected to see in a royal guard's face: understanding, compassion, and genuine concern. James quickly looked straight ahead again, but the damage was done. The wall between them had been cracked. Marcus felt a surge of energy run through his cold, tired body. The guard had seen him, really seen him as a human being worthy of attention. "Thank you," Marcus whispered, so quietly that only James could. "Here, thank you for seeing me." James felt his heart racing. He had broken protocol, risked his career, violated his training, and somehow it felt like the most right thing he had ever done. The rain continued to fall, but something had shifted. Marcus was still sitting on the wet pavement, still shivering, still waiting, but now he knew he wasn't invisible. He knew that behind the uniform and the training was a real person who cared about what happened to him. James stared straight ahead, but his mind was racing. He was thinking about rules and regulations, about duty and humanity, about the difference between following orders and doing what's right. He was thinking about his sister Sarah, about what he would want someone to do if she were in Marcus's position. Most of all, he was thinking about what he was going to do next, because James Patterson, royal guard, protector of tradition, follower of rules, was starting to realize that some things were more important than protocol. Some moments required a person to choose between being a good soldier and being a good human being, and Marcus, cold and wet but no longer hopeless, sensed that the real confrontation was just beginning. The rain had stopped, but Marcus was still soaked to the bone. His lips were purple now, and his shivering had become violent. James could see that the boy was reaching the limits of what his body could handle, but Marcus showed no signs of giving up. As evening approached, something unexpected happened. A small crowd had begun to gather again, but these weren't tourists. They were other street kids, young people who looked just like Marcus, thin, poorly dressed, with the hard expressions of those who had learned to survive on their own. "Marcus," called out a girl who couldn't have been more than 15. Her name was Emma, and she had been living on the streets even longer than Marcus. "Come on, mate, you're going to get sick. This isn't worth it." But Marcus shook his head. Without taking his eyes off James, "Someone needs to listen, Emma. Someone needs to know what's happening to us." More kids gathered around. There was Tommy, a 16-year-old, who had been kicked out of his home for being gay. There was Aisha, a 14-year-old, who had run away from an abusive foster family. There was David, who had been on his own since his mother died of a drug overdose. They all had stories, all had pain, all had reasons for being where they were. James found himself looking at each of their faces, and what he saw broke his heart. These weren't dangerous criminals or lazy troublemakers like some people claimed. These were children who had been failed by the system, kids who had nowhere else to turn. Emma sat down next to Marcus, followed by Tommy, then Aisha, then David. One by one, all the street kids sat down on the wet pavement in front of the palace gates. They didn't say anything, but their message was clear. If Marcus was making a stand, they were standing with him. James felt the weight of all their eyes on him. It wasn't just one desperate boy anymore. It was a dozen young people, all looking to him for some sign that their lives mattered, that their suffering was seen, that someone in power cared about what happened to them. The pressure was enormous. James could feel his commanding officer watching from inside the guardhouse. He knew that Captain Morrison was probably getting reports about the unusual situation outside. Breaking character once for just a moment might be overlooked. But what these kids seemed to be asking for would require him to completely abandon his post, as if summoned by James's thoughts. Captain Morrison appeared at the gate. He was a stern man in his 50s, with gray hair and cold blue eyes. He'd been in the military for 30 years and believed absolutely in discipline and order. "Patterson," he barked. "What's the situation here?" James remained at attention, staring straight ahead, but he could see the captain approaching out of the corner of his eye. "Sir, a group of young people have been protesting outside the gates." Sir James replied in his most professional voice. Captain Morrison looked at the kids sitting on the ground, his expression showing clear disgust. "Homeless troublemakers by the look of them. Have them moved along immediately." "With respect, sir," James found himself saying, They haven't broken any laws. They're on public property, protesting peacefully. The captain's eyebrows shot up. It was unusual for guards to question orders or offer opinions about policy. Marcus watched this exchange with growing hope. His guard was standing up for them, defending their right to be there. It was more support than Marcus had received from any authority figure in years. "These people," Captain Morrison said, gesturing dismissively at the kids, "are not our concern. Our job is to guard the palace, not to provide social services to street urchins." The word urchins hit Marcus like a slap. He stood up slowly, water still dripping from his clothes, and looked directly at Captain Morrison. "Street urchins." Marcus's voice was quiet but carried an edge of steel. "Is that what you see when you look at us? Not people, not kids who need help, just ... urchins?" Captain looked surprised that Marcus had dared to speak directly to him. "Young man, I suggest you and your friends find somewhere else to spend your evening before I call the police." "Call them," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger. "Call them and tell them that a bunch of kids sat quietly on a public sidewalk asking for help. Tell them that we didn't steal anything, didn't hurt anyone, didn't break any laws. Tell them we just wanted someone to listen." Emma stood up next to Marcus, then Tommy, then all the others. They formed a line facing the captain, but there was no aggression in their posture. They looked tired, sad, and determined. "We're not going anywhere," Emma said quietly. "This might be the only chance we ever get to make someone in power hear us." James felt something fundamental shifting inside. He looked at these brave young people, standing up to authority despite having nothing to lose except their dignity. He thought about his own comfortable life, his regular paycheck, his warm apartment waiting for him at the end of his shift. Then he thought about his oath as a royal guard to protect and serve. But who was he really protecting? And who was he really serving? Captain Morrison was getting red in the face. "Patterson, I want these individuals removed from the premises immediately." James felt the weight of the moment. Every eye was on him, the kids hoping for support, the captain expecting obedience, the growing crowd of evening pedestrians watching to see what would happen. This was the moment when James Patterson had to decide who he really was. "Sir James," said slowly, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air, "I respectfully request permission to speak with these young people about their concerns." The silence that followed was deafening. Captain Morrison's face went from red to purple. "Request denied, Patterson. You are a royal guard, not a social worker. Return to your position immediately." But James didn't move back to his post. Instead, he took a step forward, closer to the gate where Marcus and the other kids were standing. It was a small step, but it felt like crossing an ocean. "Sir, these young people have legitimate concerns about city policy that affects their safety and well-being. As public servants shouldn't we at least listen to what they have to say?" The captain's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Patterson, you are one word away from a court-martial. Return to your position now." James felt his heart pounding, but his voice remained steady. "With all due respect, sir, I became a guard to protect people. All people, not just the ones who live in palaces." A gasp went through the crowd that had gathered to watch. Even Marcus looked shocked. He had hoped the guard might show some sympathy, but he never expected him to directly disobey orders. Captain Morrison stepped closer to James, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You have 10 seconds to return to your post, or I will have you arrested for insubordination and stripped of rank. Your career will be over." James looked at the captain, then at Marcus and the other kids. He thought about his 8 years of perfect service, his spotless record, his pension, his future. Everything he had worked for was about to disappear. But then he looked into Marcus's eyes again, and he saw something that made his decision easy. He saw hope. Real hope. For the first time in this young man's face since the confrontation began. "Captain Morrison," James said, his voice carrying across the square, "I have served faithfully for 8 years. I have never missed a shift, never complained about conditions, never questioned orders. But I cannot stand here and pretend these children are invisible when they're asking for help." The captain pulled out his radio. "Security, I need backup at the main gate." We have a situation. Marcus stepped closer to the bars of the gate. You don't have to do this, he said to James. You don't have to lose your job for us. We're nobody special. James looked directly at Marcus for the first time while on duty, abandoning all pretense of being a statue. That's where you're wrong, he said clearly. You are special. Every single one of you matters. And someone should have told you that a long time ago. Emma started crying. Not from sadness, but from relief. In all her years on the streets, no adult in authority had ever said anything like that to her. I want to hear your stories, James continued, ignoring the captain's furious shouting. I want to know what happened to your sister, Marcus. I want to know why you're all out here instead of safe at home. And I want to know what you think should be done about it. The crowd around them had grown large now. People were recording on their phones, posting to social media. The story of the Royal Guard who broke ranks to listen to homeless kids was spreading across the internet in real time. Captain Morrison grabbed James by the shoulder. You're finished, Patterson. Security is coming to arrest you. But James gently removed the captain's hand and walked closer to the gate. He knelt down so he was at eye level with Marcus, who was still sitting on the ground. Tell me about your sister, James said softly. Marcus looked around, hardly believing this was really happening. The tough, angry expression he had worn for hours melted away, placed by the vulnerable face of a 17-year-old boy who had been carrying too much pain for too long. Her name was Lucy, Marcus began, his voice shaking. She was funny and smart, and she loved to draw. She wanted to be an artist when she grew up. James listened, really listened, as Marcus told him about how they had been put in foster care after their parents died in a car accident, how they had been separated and placed in different homes, how Lucy had been mistreated and ran away to find Marcus on the streets, how they had tried to take care of each other, sharing whatever food they could find, keeping each other warm on cold nights. Last winter was really bad, Marcus continued, tears flowing freely now. She got pneumonia, but we couldn't afford a doctor. By the time someone called an ambulance, it was too late. James felt his own eyes filling with tears. Behind him, he could hear Captain Morrison calling for backup, threatening disciplinary action, demanding that he return to his post. But all of that seemed far away and unimportant compared to this moment of human connection. I'm so sorry, James said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. No child should have to go through what you've been through. One by one, the other kids began sharing their stories. Tommy talked about being rejected by his family for who he was. Aisha described the foster home where older kids had hurt her. David spoke about watching his mother die and having nowhere else to go. Each story was heartbreaking. But James listened to every word. He asked questions, showed genuine interest, treated each of them like they mattered. For many of these kids, it was the first time in years that an adult had given them their full attention. The security guards arrived. But they hesitated when they saw the scene. This wasn't what they had expected. They'd come prepared to arrest a rogue guard and disperse. Some troublemakers. Instead, they found what looked like a counseling session, with a guard who was clearly trying to help rather than cause problems. Captain Morrison was beside himself with fury. But the growing crowd was watching everything, recording everything. Any action he took now would be seen by thousands of people online. James stood up and faced his captain. I know you have to do your job. I know there will be consequences for my actions, but I don't regret it. These kids needed someone to listen, and I'm glad it was me. The captain looked around at all the cameras pointed at him. At the crowd that had grown to several hundred people, at the social media posts that were already going viral. He realized that James had put him in an impossible position. Whatever happened next would determine not just the fate of one guard and a group of homeless kids, but the future of how the world saw the royal family's commitment to serving all their people. The situation had completely spiraled beyond Captain Morrison's control. News crews were arriving, drawn by the viral social media posts. The hashtag guard who listened was trending across multiple platforms. Videos of James kneeling to listen to Marcus's story had been viewed millions of times in just a few hours. Inside the palace, emergency meetings were being called. Palace communications staff were frantically trying to figure out how to handle the public relations crisis unfolding at their front gates. Some wanted James arrested immediately to show that discipline would be maintained. Others worried that arresting a guard for showing compassion to homeless children would be a public relations disaster. Meanwhile, something beautiful was happening outside the gates. Word had spread through London's homeless community, and more people were arriving. Not just young people now, but families with small children, elderly individuals who had lost their homes, veterans who had fallen through the cracks of the system. They came quietly, respectfully, and sat down near Marcus and his friends. Each person who arrived added to the peaceful but powerful presence outside the palace. They weren't protesting violently or making demands. They were simply existing, being visible, showing the world that homelessness had faces and stories. James found himself moving from person to person, listening to story after story. There was Margaret, a 70-year-old woman who had lost her apartment when her pension wasn't enough to keep up with rising rent. There was Robert, a war veteran with PTSD who couldn't hold down a steady job. There was Maria, a mother with 2 young children who had fled an abusive relationship and now lived in their car. Each story James heard made him more convinced that breaking protocol had been the right thing to do. These weren't statistics or social problems. They were real people with real pain, and they deserved to be heard. Captain Morrison watched with growing anxiety as James continued to engage with the crowd. The captain had called his superiors, but the responses he was getting were confusing and contradictory. Some wanted immediate action, others wanted him to wait for higher-level decisions. Then something unexpected happened. A black sedan pulled up to the palace gates, and out stepped a woman in an elegant but simple dress. The crowd recognized her. Immediately, it was Princess Catherine, one of the younger members of the royal family known for her charity work. The princess had been watching the news, coverage from inside the palace, and had made a decision that surprised everyone. Instead of waiting for official protocols and committee decisions, she had decided to come out and see the situation for herself. Captain Morrison snapped to attention. "Your Royal Highness, I apologize for this disruption. We're handling the situation and will have these individuals removed immediately." But Princess Catherine raised her hand to stop him. "Captain, I'd like to speak with Officer Patterson first." James felt his knees go weak. He had been prepared for arrest, court, martial, and dismissal. He had not been prepared to explain his actions to a member of the royal family. "Your Highness," he said, bowing respectfully. "Officer Patterson, I've been watching the news coverage. Can you help me understand what's happening here?" James looked at Marcus, then at all the other people who had joined him on the sidewalk. "Your Highness, these people came here because they felt they had nowhere else to turn. They're facing problems that are literally matters of life and death: homelessness, hunger, lack of medical care. They're not asking for handouts. They're asking for someone in power to acknowledge that their lives have value." The princess looked at the crowd of people sitting peacefully on the ground. Many of them were staring at her in amazement. They had never been this close to royalty before. "And you felt it was important to listen to them?" she asked James. "Yes, Your Highness. I know I broke protocol, and I'm prepared to face the consequences. But I couldn't stand there pretending these people were invisible when they were asking for help." Princess Catherine nodded thoughtfully, then did something that shocked everyone present. She walked over to Marcus, who was still sitting on the wet ground, and knelt down beside him. "Hello," she said gently. "I'm Catherine. Officer Patterson told me you lost your sister. I'm very sorry for your loss." Marcus stared at her, hardly believing this was real. A princess, an actual princess, was kneeling on the dirty sidewalk, talking to him like he was a real person. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice hoarse from hours of talking. "Will you tell me about her?" the princess asked. And so Marcus found himself telling Lucy's story again, this time to royalty. But Princess Catherine listened with the same genuine attention that James had shown, asking questions about Lucy's drawings, her dreams, her personality. The crowd watched in amazement as the princess moved from person to person, spending time with each individual, learning their names and their stories. She spoke with Margaret about the challenges of aging without family support. She listened to Robert's struggles with PTSD, She heard Maria's fears about keeping her children safe while living in a car. The news cameras captured every moment. But this wasn't about public relations anymore. This was about human beings connecting. Across the artificial barriers of class and status, Captain Morrison stood frozen, completely out of his depth. Nothing in his 30 years of military training had prepared him for this situation. A member of the royal family was sitting on a dirty sidewalk having conversations with homeless people, while one of his guards had abandoned his post to act as a social worker. But as the captain watched the princess interact with the crowd, he began to see something he had missed before. These weren't troublemakers or criminals. They were people in pain. People who had been failed by the systems that were supposed to protect them. The real shock came when Princess Catherine stood up and addressed the entire crowd. Her voice was clear and carried across the square. I want everyone here to know that your stories matter. Your lives have value. We, all of us in positions of privilege and power, have a responsibility to do better. She turned to Captain Morrison. Captain, I want these people to know they're welcome to stay here as long as they need to. They're not trespassing. They're exercising their right to petition for help. Then she looked at James. Officer Patterson, you've shown tremendous courage and compassion tonight. The royal family needs more people like you, not fewer. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. People were crying, hugging each other, hardly believing what they had just witnessed. But the biggest transformation was yet to come. 3 months later, Marcus stood in front of a mirror in his new apartment, hardly recognizing the young man staring back at him. His hair was clean and neatly cut, his clothes were new and fit properly, and most importantly, his eyes held hope. Instead of desperation, the confrontation at the palace gates had changed everything. Not just for Marcus, but for hundreds of people across London. The viral videos had sparked a national conversation about homelessness and social responsibility that couldn't be ignored. Princess Catherine had been true to her word. Within days of that evening, she had announced the creation of the Lucy Memorial Foundation, named after Marcus's sister. The foundation provided emergency housing, job training, and mental health services for homeless youth. The old community center that was supposed to be demolished had been saved and renovated into a comprehensive support center. But perhaps the most surprising change was in James Patterson himself. Instead of being court-martialed as Captain Morrison had threatened, James had been reassigned to a new position created specifically for him, Community Liaison Officer for the Royal Guard. His job was to build bridges between the palace and London's most vulnerable communities. James had taken to his new role with the same dedication he had once shown to standing perfectly still. He spent his days visiting shelters, talking to social workers, and making sure that the voices of the homeless and forgotten were heard in the halls of power. Marcus had become James's unofficial partner in this work. After getting stable housing and completing his education through the Foundation's programs, Marcus had discovered he had a gift for connecting with other street kids who were still struggling. He could reach young people who wouldn't trust other adults because he had been where they were. On this particular morning, Marcus was getting ready for a very special event. The Lucy Memorial Foundation was opening its 3rd location. Both he and James were scheduled to speak at the ceremony. As Marcus walked to the event, he passed the palace gates where it had all began. Same guards were on duty, standing in their traditional poses, but something was different now. Next to the guardhouse was a small office with a sign that read Community Support Services. Several times a week, James would spend hours there, available to anyone who needed help navigating city services or just needed someone to listen to their problems. The ceremony was held in the original community center, now beautifully renovated, but still serving its original purpose, providing a safe haven for those who had nowhere else to go. The room was packed with people whose lives had been changed by the events of that rainy evening. Emma was there, now studying to become a social worker. Tommy had been reunited with his family after the foundation helped them work through their issues. Aisha had been placed with a loving foster family who understood her trauma. David had found stable housing and was working toward his high school diploma. Princess Catherine spoke first, describing how the foundation had helped over 500 young people in just 3 months. She talked about the importance of listening to those who are often ignored by society. Then James was introduced. As he walked to the podium, Marcus felt a surge of pride for his friend. The man who had once been trained to ignore suffering had become one of London's most effective advocates. For the homeless? 3 months ago, James began, I thought my job was to stand perfectly still and pretend that the problems of the world didn't exist. I was wrong. My real job, all of our real jobs, is to see suffering and respond to it with compassion. Looked out at the audience, making eye contact with many of the young people he had helped over the past few months. I learned that night that there's a difference between following orders and doing what's right. Sometimes the most important thing a person can do is break the rules in service of something higher. Our shared humanity. When James finished speaking, the applause was thunderous. But he gestured for quiet because he had one more thing too. Say, I want to introduce you to the young man who taught me these lessons. Someone who had every reason to give up hope but chose instead to fight for change. Ladies and gentlemen, Marcus Williams. Marcus walked to the podium on shaking legs. Public speaking still terrified him, but he had learned that some messages were too important to keep silent. When I sat down in front of those palace gates, Marcus began, I was angry and desperate and had nothing left to lose. I thought the world had forgotten about people like me and my sister. I was wrong. He paused, looking out at all the faces in the crowd, social workers, former homeless individuals, community leaders, and members of the royal household staff, who had volunteered to help with the Foundation's programs, and I learned that sometimes one person's courage to break the rules can change everything. Officer Patterson could have ignored me that day, could have followed orders and pretended I didn't exist, but he chose to see me as a human being worth listening to. Marcus's voice grew stronger as he continued. My sister Lucy didn't live to see this day, but I know she would be proud. She always believed that people were basically good, that if you could just get them to listen, they would want to help. She was right. He looked directly at James, who was wiping tears from his eyes. That night taught me that real change doesn't come from the top down or the bottom up. It comes from the moment when people choose to connect with each other as human beings, regardless of their positions or uniforms or circumstances. Marcus gestured to the renovated community center around them. This building represents more than just a place for people to sleep. It represents the idea that everyone deserves dignity, everyone deserves to be heard, and everyone deserves a chance to build a better life. As he concluded his speech, Marcus announced something that surprised even James. Today, I'm officially enrolling in university to study social work. I want to spend my life making sure that no kid has to sleep in the rain, wondering if anyone cares whether they live or die. The applause was overwhelming, but Marcus had one final surprise. He pulled out a small, framed drawing, one of the last pictures his sister Lucy had made before she died. It showed 2 figures standing together under a rainbow, with the words, "Hope lives" written in Lucy's childish handwriting. I'm donating this drawing to the Foundation, Marcus said. I want it to hang in every center we open to remind everyone who sees it that hope lives, even in the darkest times, especially in the darkest times. After the ceremony, as people mingled and shared stories, Marcus and James found themselves standing together outside the building. The same spot where James used to stand guard was now a bustling community space, with people coming and going, getting help, finding hope. Do you ever regret it? Marcus asked. Giving up your old life? James smiled and shook his head. That wasn't living, Marcus. That was just existing. This helping people, making real connections, actually making a difference, this is living. Captain Morrison approached them, looking somewhat uncomfortable. Over the past 3 months, he had undergone his own transformation. Seeing the positive changes that had resulted from James's actions had forced him to reconsider his rigid approach to duty and discipline. Patterson, he said formally, then paused. James, he corrected himself. I owe you an apology. I was wrong that night. Saw something I missed, and you had the courage to act on it. James extended his hand to his former captain. No apology needed, sir. You were doing what you thought was right based on your training. We all were. As the sun set over London, Marcus looked up at the palace in the distance. The golden gates that had once seemed like a barrier between 2 different worlds now looked different to him. were still there, still impressive, but they no longer seemed insurmountable. He thought about his sister Lucy, about how proud she would be to see what had grown from the seeds of that desperate rainy evening. He thought about all the young people who would sleep in warm beds tonight because someone had chosen to listen rather than look away. Most of all, he thought about the power of human connection, how one moment of genuine compassion between strangers could ripple outward to change hundreds of lives. The confrontation that had begun with anger and desperation had transformed into something beautiful, a reminder that real change happens when people choose to see each other's humanity, regardless of the uniforms they wear or the circumstances that divide them. Marcus smiled as he walked home to his apartment. No longer a street punk fighting the world, but a young man with a future, carrying his sister's memory and his friends' example forward into whatever challenges lay ahead. The power shift had been instant and shocking, just as the story's title promised, but the real shock wasn't in the confrontation itself. It was in discovering that compassion, when met with courage, has the power to transform not just individuals, but entire communities. And in London that night, hope lived,